Welcome to the podcast, 'Tis But a Scratch, fact and fiction about the Middle Ages. I'm your host, Professor Richard Abels, and after 3 episodes on the fall of the Roman Republic, we are returning to our home ground, the Middle Ages, with an episode on the Norman Conquest of England. I'm so pleased to have back on the podcast one of the finest Anglo-Norman historians I know, my very good friend, Dr. Jennifer Paxton of the Catholic University of America.
It is wonderful to be back, Richard.
'Tis But a Scratch recently got some nice recognition from FeedSpot, naming it on a list of the 25 top Viking Age podcasts and 100 top Europe podcasts.
And well-deserved, too.
I've included a link to FeedSpot's list of recommended Viking Age podcasts in the show notes. Okay, so let's begin. 959 years ago, William the Bastard, Duke of Normandy, rolled the dice and won, earning himself both a kingdom and the far more flattering nickname William the Conqueror. He carried out one of the riskiest enterprises in history, an amphibious landing of Britain.
Think of the people who took on this project and failed. Philip II of Spain with the Spanish Armada, Napoleon, Hitler. None of them even made it ashore.
Yes, and both Napoleon and Hitler took a keen interest in the Bayeux Tapestry depicting Duke William's successful invasion of England.
These 3 rulers were leaders of powerful nations, even empires. Yet they failed where the ruler of a medium-sized duchy in western France succeeded. Why? That's what I hope we will be able to answer today. And I am put in mind of some advice a colleague of mine gave recently at a career panel for students at Catholic. Put yourself in the position to be lucky. That is what William did on October 14, 1066.
Today, Jenny and I will tell you the story of how lucky William was, but also of how much he did to put himself in the position to be lucky. William was able to take advantage of a number of factors: chronic instability in the English royal house, strategic and tactical errors by his opponents, and an opportune change in the weather.
But all of this would have been for naught if he hadn't had grit, nerves of steel, and some great public relations guys.
Yeah.
But this is not just the story of one brave and lucky individual. The Norman Conquest is also the story of how England's fate hung in the balance between 2 major powers that wanted to control it.
Yes, Scandinavia and Normandy. If things had turned out differently, we could all be speaking Norwegian.
Right?
The significance of the Norman Conquest in medieval history, and especially in the history of Britain, cannot be exaggerated. It's the reason why W.C. Seller and W.J. Yeatman entitled their satiric take on English history, 1066, and all that, a memorable history of England.
I love that book.
Yeah. So do I. I'm not sure if you've ever encountered, but there's another oldie but goodie, Richard Armour's Twisted Tales from Shakespeare.
I need to go right out and read that.
As school teachers, Seller and Yeatman helpfully divided the great events of English history into good things, capital G, and bad things, capital B.
And they also divided English kings into good kings and bad kings.
Yes. Sellers and Yeatman assured their readers that the Norman Conquest was a good thing. Quote, as from this time onwards, England stopped being conquered and thus was able to become top nation. End quote. Though the reality was that William the Conqueror had to deal with 2 Danish invasions and the threat of a third during his reign, England would again be invaded a century and a half later, this time from France. In the year 1216, the rebel barons of Magna Carta fame repudiated bad King John and invited Prince Louis, heir to the French throne, to replace him as King of England. Unlike Philip II, Napoleon, and Hitler, Louis and his troops actually managed to land in England, but had no more success in conquering it than they did.
You missed one successful invasion.
Really?
Yes. The Dutch ruler, William of Orange's invasion of England in 1688.
But that's a glorious revolution!
Well, just because it has gone down in history as a good thing doesn't change the fact that it was an invasion, albeit one with a lot of English support.
Yeah. It took England a long, long time to become top nation.
Not that the Victorians had any doubt about that, or the importance of the Norman Conquest to the rise of the British Empire. Throughout the 19th century and much of the 20th century, English academic historians used 1066 to mark the beginning of the Middle Ages, at least the Middle Ages in Britain.
But actually not just for the Middle Ages. At both Oxford and Cambridge universities in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century, 1066 marked the beginning of the modern history curriculum.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And it's when you start recounting the kings.
Yes, it is. Yeah. King Edward I really should be Edward III, but neither Edward the Martyr nor Edward the Confessor are numbered kings. So, Victorian historians agreed that the Battle of Hastings was a critical event in English history, though they disagreed with fervor whether it was a good thing or a bad thing. For Edward Freeman, a political liberal and a champion of the racial superiority of the Anglo-Saxon peoples, and no, the two were not incompatible in the late 19th century, for Edward Freeman, who fervently believed that England owed Parliament and the English jury system to the Anglo-Saxons, the Norman Conquest was a bad thing, ameliorated to a degree by William the Conqueror's prudent preservation of the superior governmental administration he inherited.
Richard, I can see why your colleagues in the field have eschewed the label of Anglo-Saxon historians for the less politically charged historians of early medieval England. But Freeman did believe that the Norman Conquest was of fundamental importance to English history. You don't devote 12 years to writing a 3-volume work entitled The Norman Conquest, Its Causes and Its Results, unless you believe that.
Of course he did, but for the Whig historian Freeman, 1066 was more of a significant bump in the road to England's ideal constitutional monarchy than a derailment. He knew that in centuries to come, the English would throw off the Norman yoke and recover their ancient Anglo-Saxon liberties just in time to become top nation.
Tory historians and Anglo-Norman historians in general viewed the Norman Conquest more favorably throughout the 19th and the 20th centuries. For Freeman's most ferocious critic, J. Horace Round, the formidable J. Horace Round, the Norman Conquest was a good thing. Round, who based his research on archival materials rather than the chronicles and narrative sources upon which Freeman relied.
Which really is ironic, given that Freeman was Regius Professor of Modern History at Oxford and Round never had an academic post.
Well, British academia is rife with these people who were consequential figures despite not having had
any academic
credentials.
Yeah.
It's equally ironic that Round's view of the Norman Conquest as a watershed in English history, marking the beginning of the Middle Ages, became the dominant view among academics until challenged in the last few decades of the 20th century.
I can't resist one further 19th century take on the Norman Conquest. For Charles Dodgson, who's better known by his pen name, Lewis Carroll, the Norman Conquest was the driest subject one can imagine.
Well, what can you expect from a mathematician?
Now, STEM professors are our brethren.
They are.
In Chapter 3 of Alice in Wonderland, Alice, having cried up a river, sits drenched, surrounded by, and I quote, a queer-looking party that assembled on the bank, the birds with draggled feathers, the animals with their fur clinging close to them, and all dripping wet, cross, and uncomfortable. The first question, of course, was how to get dry again. They had a consultation about this. At last the mouse, who seemed to be a person of authority among them, called out, quote, sit down, all of you, and listen to me. I'll soon make you dry enough. They all sat down at once in a large ring, with the mouse in the center. Ahem, said the mouse with an important air. Are you all ready? This is the driest thing I know. Silence all around, if you please. William the Conqueror, whose cause was favored by the Pope, was soon submitted to by the English, who wanted leaders and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edward and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria. Ugh, said the Lory with a shiver. I beg your pardon, said Mouse, frowning but very politely. Did you speak? Not I, said the Lory hastily. I thought you did, said the Mouse. I proceed. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand, the patriotic Archbishop of Canterbury, found it advisable to go with Edgar Atheling to meet William and offer him the crown. William's conduct at first was moderate, but the insolence of his Normans. "How are you getting on now, my dear?" he continued, turning to Alice as it spoke. "As wet as ever," said Alice in a melancholy tone. "It doesn't seem to dry me at all."
I actually was loving it. I wanted to hear more.
The serious point is that writing in 1865, Lewis Carroll thought that the one event in English history that his young readers would certainly be familiar with and bored by is the Norman Conquest. Disney included this history lesson in the 1951 animated movie, although he altered the context.
So Disney's Alice in Wonderland begins with Alice receiving a history lesson about the Norman Conquest by her nanny.
And is bored to tears until distracted by the appearance of the White Rabbit.
He does, and had been of late much accustomed to usurpation and conquest. Edwin and Morcar, the Earls of Mercia and Northumbria, declared for him, and even Stigand. Alice. I'm listening. And even Stigand, the Archbishop of Canterbury, agreed to meet with William and offer him the crown. Alice, will you kindly pay attention and recite your lesson?
We will do our best not to bore you in retelling what Richard and I both believe to be a really interesting and complex story. I used the Norman Conquest in my methods class as a case study in historical causality, and that is how I would like to approach our discussion.
That's fine with me. So let's begin with the factors that help explain William's decision to attempt an invasion and why it proved successful.
Now, the first factor that helped William conquer England will take the longest to explain, and that is English political instability.
Yes. Well, we need to go back 50 years before the Norman Conquest to 1016, when England was conquered. Yes, England was conquered before that, was conquered by the Danes under their king, Cnut. Cnut turned out to be a successful king of England for nearly 20 years and the ruler of a Scandinavian-based empire, but he was not able to create a stable dynasty because his two sons, by his two different wives, had no children of their own. This meant that in 1042, the throne reverted back to the native English dynasty when a man known as Edward the Confessor, son of the much maligned King Athelred the Unready, came to power.
Edward's family connections are critical to our story. As we mentioned, he was the son of the famous English king Athelred. That's where he got his claim to the English throne. But his mother was Emma, sister of the Duke of Normandy, so Edward was half Norman. In fact, he had grown up in exile in Normandy while the Danes had been ruling England. So when he took over in 1042, he hadn't had time to build up his own network of supporters. It could take years to cultivate the kinds of personal relationships that made this society tick. So Edward pretty much had to accept the existing noble power structures.
Yes.
As a result, Edward's reign was dominated by a very difficult relationship with the very powerful family known as the Godwinsons, headed up by Earl Godwin of Wessex. The Godwinsons were a noble English family that had married into the Danish aristocracy, and this had been their ticket to rise to power under Cnut.
Godwin's ancestry is obscure, which is really a bit odd given that his daughter, Queen Edith, commissioned a vita, a life, of her husband, King Edward, that eulogizes Edith's family. The author of the tract assures us that Godwin was, in his words, blessed in his ancestral stock, but doesn't even name his father. There is good reason to believe, however, that Godwin was a Thane of Sussex, where the bulk of his lands lay in King Edward's reign. He was probably the son of the South Saxon Thane Wulfnoth Childe. The Old English word childe literally means child, but by the 11th century it had come to connote a young man of noble rank. Wulfnoth fell victim to the internal palace intrigues that plagued King Athelred's reign. In 1009, Athelred had assembled at Sandwich in Kent an immense fleet of some 300 ships to counter an imminent Viking invasion. While the fleet waited in port, a Mercian thane, Bertric, brother of the king's favorite and his son-in-law, the notorious Eadric Striona, Ealdorman of Mercia, suddenly accused Wulfnoth of treason.
Eadric's nickname Striona means the appropriator or grabber. It was given to him by a monastic chronicler because of Eadric's seizure of church lands. Eadric is the main villain in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles account of the Danish conquest of England. He became a byword for treachery in later medieval chronicle accounts of the reign of Athelred the Unready. He was named the worst Briton of the 11th century in a poll of historians conducted by the BBC History magazine in 2005.
Can you believe there's actually a poll of the worst person for each century?
I think that's so fantastically nerdy.
Yeah, it really is. So, Eadric Striona was a Mercian thane from a prominent local family. He entered the top echelons of the English elite through an act of violence and treachery. In 1006, Eadric orchestrated the murder of Elfhelm, Ealdorman of southern Northumbria. Eadric invited the Ealdorman to his manor at Shrewsbury for what was supposed to be a friendly visit, and it was a friendly visit for a couple of days as the two feasted together, but then Eadric took Elfhelm on a hunt, a favorite activity of the English nobility. Lying in ambush was a paid henchman who killed the Ealdorman. The killing apparently was done with King Athelred's approval, as the king followed it up by having the Ealdorman's 2 sons blinded. As for Eadric, rather than answer for his role in the murder of an Ealdorman, Athelred appointed him Ealdorman of Mercia. Athelred then gave his sister in marriage to the new Ealdorman of Mercia. By that time in his reign, Athelred had grown suspicious of the loyalties of the old aristocratic families. One of Eadric's virtues was that he was a nobody who owed his rank and wealth to Athelred's goodwill and patronage. Athelred may not have been unready in the sense of ill-prepared to fight the Vikings, but he was unrad in the Old English sense of the word, an ill-advised king, and that was in part because Athelred was a lousy judge of character when it came to the people he chose to advise him.
And that brings us back to Bertric's accusation against Wulfnoth. Both the accusation and Wulfnoth's response to it should be understood in this context of court rivalries. Wulfnoth, not wishing to share Elfhelm's or his son's fate, took matters into his own hands. He persuaded the captain and crews of 20 ships to follow him, and went a Viking, ravaging the southern coast of England. The king entrusted Bertric with 80 ships to bring the pirate to bear, but a storm came up and sunk much of the fleet. The ships that managed to make it ashore were burnt by Wulfnoth. When news of the disaster reached King Athelred, he and his chief counselors decided to return to the safety of London, and the great fleet dispersed. Wulfnoth was outlawed and his lands confiscated. But his son Godwin weathered his father's disgrace by attaching himself to the king's eldest son, Athelstan, who, in his will, left to him one of those confiscated estates.
For someone who is to become as prominent as Godwin was, it's strange that we know virtually nothing about him during the reigns of either Athelred or of his son and successor Edmund Ironside. Godwin may, and I underscore may, Godwin may be the Thane Godwin who would test royal charters in 1012 and 1014, which would be consistent with his appearance as a beneficiary in the Atheling Athelstan's will. But that will, dated 1014, is actually the first time that Godwin appears in the historical record with any certainty. But he seems to have done something to win the favor and patronage of Cnut during the first 2 years of the new king's reign.
Definitely. Godwin rose while the native English ruling class fell under Cnut and his 2 sons. Cnut began his reign as sole king of England in 1016 with a political purge, executing or exiling virtually all of his predecessors' ealdormen and courtiers.
Eadric Striona survived the purge. He had adroitly and treacherously switched sides during the Battle of Assendon, giving Cnut the victory over Edmund Ironside. As a reward, he was allowed to retain Mercia, but Cnut didn't trust Eadric.
Which made him a lot savvier than either Athelred or Edmund Ironside.
Yes. Within a year, Cnut ordered Eadric's execution, along with those of 3 other high-ranking English nobles. According to the Encomium Emi Reginae, a key source for Cnut's reign, Cnut explained that he did so because these men, I love this, because these men had failed to fight faithfully for their liege lord Edmund, and he expected they would similarly betray him when it became opportune. When Eadric indignantly protested that Cnut owed him his throne, Cnut responded by telling Earl Eric Håkonsson, quote, to pay this man what we owe him. The Earl nodded and then chopped off Eadric's head with an axe. I suspect that there was a personal as well as political element to this. Cnut's first wife was Elfgifu of Northampton, daughter of Ealdorman Elfham, whose murder Eadric had orchestrated.
I think we can agree that Cnut was pretty badass.
Yeah, he was pretty badass.
Now, upon ascending the throne, Cnut divided England into 4 large regional earldoms. As Richard said, Eadric was left in charge of Mercia.
Only briefly.
Yes, briefly. East Anglia was given to the great Viking mercenary captain Torkel the Tall, and Northumbria was entrusted to Cnut's brother-in-law, the Norwegian Earl Eric. Cnut himself kept personal control over Wessex, the most valuable of the 4 earldoms, and that's very much in keeping with him seeing himself as the inheritor of the Wessex kingdom.
I very much agree. Cnut may have been king by conquest, but he wanted to be more than that. He wanted to be seen as a rightful English king, and the legitimacy of his rule is a leitmotif in the sources for his reign. The Treaty of Olney, negotiated in the wake of Cnut's victory in the Battle of Ashington, had divided England into 2 kingdoms. Edmund was to retain the throne of Wessex, while Cnut was recognized as the ruler of Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. When Edmund died a month later, Cnut did not militarily seize Wessex, but he traveled to London accompanied by a large military force to persuade the West Saxon Royal Council to elect him as king. They did so, passing over the claims of Edmund's brothers, including the adult Eadwy, who was to be executed a year later, and Edmund's young sons. Cnut could claim Wessex as its rightfully elected and anointed king. Given that England had been ruled by a West Saxon dynasty, I'm not surprised that Cnut's initial inclination was to rule Wessex directly.
That became untenable when Cnut added the Danish throne to his English one in 1018. He then looked for a loyal follower to whom he could entrust Wessex, and found him in Godwin.
Cnut had begun his reign of England as a conqueror. He continued the army tax that King Athelred had imposed to pay for Thorkel the Tall's mercenary fleet, using the monies to pay for his own military household troops, the housecalls, and his own fleet. Like William the Conqueror's construction of the White Tower of London, the purpose was not to defend England against foreign invasion, but against possible internal native revolt. But under the tutelage of Archbishop Wulfstan, Cnut was persuaded that the surest way to secure his rule over England was to recast himself as a traditional English king, which involved the revival of the political fortunes of some, not all, but some of the English nobles who had proved loyal to him.
Godwin was one, and Leofric, son of Athelred's ealdorman of the Huica, Leofwina, was another.
Yes, Earl Leofric, whose wife, Godgifu, achieved fame as Lady Godiva.
Godwin became Earl of Wessex, while Leofric was given Mercia. Leofric's resurrection of his family fortunes reflects the change in Cnut's approach to governance and the native aristocracy. Among the 3 English nobles executed alongside Eadric Striona was Leofric's elder brother Northman. How and why Leofric survived the purge is unknown.
While Leofric was the son and brother of Ealdorman, Godwin came from lesser nobility. He embraced an Anglo-Danish identity by marrying a Danish noblewoman, Githa Thorkel's daughter, which made him a member of Cnut's extended family. As Githa's brother, Earl Ulf, was married to Cnut's sister.
I always have to look at that on a genealogy to keep it straight.
Yeah.
Godwin's Anglo-Danish social identity is reflected in the names he gave his sons. Sweyn, Harold, Tostig, Garth, Leofwine, and Wulfnoth, a fantastic mix of both Anglo-Saxon and Danish.
And it's really interesting that the eldest sons were given the Scandinavian names. His younger sons get the English names.
Right. Godwin's power and wealth grew throughout the reigns of Cnut and his two sons. Edward the Confessor essentially inherited him when he came to the throne in 1042. Godwin is a power to be reckoned with and could not be shunted aside.
Even though Godwin was suspected of complicity in the killing of Edward's younger brother Alfred. In 1035, Alfred responded to news of Cnut's death by sailing to England with a mercenary force from Normandy to restore English rule. He was met by Godwin, taken into custody by Godwin, and subsequently was blinded and killed. An example of just how tangled family relations were in this period, when Cnut's son, King Harald Hardrada, died and was succeeded by Harold's half-brother, Harthacnut, the new king brought charges against Godwin and Leifing, Bishop of Worcester and Crediton, for the murder of his half-brother. Yes, Harthacnut and Alfred were also half-brothers, as both were sons of the Norman princess Emma. Leifing lost his bishopric. Godwin survived by giving Harthacnut a warship with 80 men and swearing an oath that he had not wanted Alfred to be blinded and that anything he had done was only in obedience to King Harold. Which strikes me as a really carefully worded oath. What it doesn't say is, I swear that I had nothing to do with the atheling's blinding or his death. Harthacnut accepted the ship and the oath. He probably was not persuaded of Godwin's innocence any more than Edward would be, but it was one thing for a new king coming from abroad to relieve a bishop, if bishops belong to the king after all, relieve a bishop of his see, another to depose the most powerful earl in England. In 1042, Edward had little choice but to accept or at least ignore Godwin's involvement in his brother's killing. Their relationship was transactional. Godwin's support was crucial to Edward being invited to return from Normandy to ascend the English throne. In return, Godwin made sure that King Edward gave earldoms to his sons. By the middle of Edward's reign, after Godwin himself had died, various Godwin sons controlled about half of England.
And Godwin also provided for his daughter Edith rather spectacularly. He married her to the king. So Godwin was now the king's father-in-law, and doubtless he hoped to become the grandfather of the future king of England. But the trouble was that the marriage remained childless.
I thought that Edward the Confessor remained a virgin.
Yeah.
Okay.
The failure of Edward and Edith to have a son would have tremendous consequences for English history, because it would provide the opening for William of Normandy to claim the English throne. So the fertility problems of the royal couple proved very lucky for William.
Another piece of luck.
Right. So you have this very dominant noble family that is tied to the English throne by marriage. It's a very unstable situation because, of course, these people don't really like each other.
No.
And in fact, at one point, the king lost patience with the Godwinsons and drove them into exile. But they managed to claw their way back into power.
It's worth saying a few words about that, as it touches upon Edward's Norman associations. Edward, as Jenny said, grew up in exile in Normandy in the courts of his uncle, Duke Richard II, and his cousin, Duke Robert I, father of William the Conqueror. Duke William was a child of 7 when Edward returned to England to assume the throne. Among those who accompanied Edward to England was his nephew Ralph, the son of his sister Godwin, who acquired the unflattering nickname the Timid, and the Norman monk Robert of Jumièges, whom he made Bishop of London. In the fall of 1050, Eadcia, Archbishop of Canterbury, died. The monks of Canterbury elected on one of their own number, a monk by the name of Athelric. Now, Athelric was a kinsman of Godwin, and Godwin was then the Earl of Wessex, which included Kent. So what did the monks do? They appealed to the Earl to support their election. And they needed to do this because there really is no such thing as free elections at this point. Abbots and bishops were appointed by the king. And the clergy of the church and the monks of the monastery would have to accept whoever the king named. They wouldn't really have any free elections in England for another 50 years or so. So filling these ecclesiastical offices was still the prerogative of the king, and Edward knew whom he wanted as his archbishop, and that was Robert of Jumièges. Godwin's appeal was ignored, and Robert became archbishop. Robert immediately complained to the king that Godwin had despoiled the Church of Canterbury of some estates, and reminded Edwin of Godwin's role in the blinding and death of his brother. Meanwhile, another French kinsman of the king visited England. This was Eustace of Boulogne. When Eustace and his entourage sought billeting in the port city of Dover, a fight with an innkeeper grew into a brawl, and that developed into a virtual battle in which 20 townspeople and 19 of Eustace's men were killed. Eustace fled back to Edward and demanded justice, which took the form of the king ordering Godwin to ravage Kent and Dover. This is not as weird as it might sound. Between 948 and 1041, 5 English kings had ordered the ravaging of English towns and shires as punishment for disobedience. It was a violent age. When Godwin refused to ravage his own earldom, the king summoned all of his earls to a council at Gloucester. They all appeared with armed followings, and it looked like a civil war was imminent. The council dispersed without fighting, but King Edward ordered Godwin to give him hostages and appear at a second council in London on the 21st of September to answer for the charges against him. When Edward refused Godwin's request for an open trial in which he could acquit himself with an oath, and for safety conducts and hostages for him to ensure his son's and his own safety in going to this meeting, Godwin knew that the best he could expect was exile, and more likely the verdict would be death. He and his sons chose instead to flee England and seek support abroad. Godwin, his wife Githa, and his sons Sweyn, Gurth, and Tostig set sail to Flanders, present-day Belgium, where they received refuge from Tostig's father-in-law, Count Baldwin. Harold and Leofwin, meanwhile, escaped to Ireland. Edward responded by outlawing Godwin and his sons and confiscating their earldoms. He repudiated his barren queen, confiscated her lands, and sent her to a nunnery. That lasted for less than a year. In the summer of 1052, Godwin returned from Flanders and Harold and Leofwin from Ireland. At first, they ravaged like Vikings, but then they shifted gears, asking the locals for provisions and appealed to their former followers and subjects for support. Godwin's refusal of the king's order to ravage Kent and hatred for the king's Norman and French favorites won him the popular support he needed to challenge the king. King Edward retired to London and summoned all who owed military service to join him. He wanted to fight. But when push came to shove, Earl Leofrich of Mercia and Earl Siward of Northumbria refused to engage Godwin. They insisted upon a reconciliation. Lacking the necessary military force to deal with his rebel father-in-law, Edward reluctantly agreed. He allowed Godwin to clear himself of all charges with an oath, exchanged with him the kiss of peace, and restored his son and his own earldoms and holdings. Queen Edith was returned to the king's bed. The loser was Archbishop Robert. Outlawed, he returned to his monastery of Jumièges, where he undoubtedly helped shape the chronicler William of Jumièges' take on the Norman Conquest. Godwin and his sons had won out.
This is really, in a sense, the civil war that did not happen.
Yes.
It really could have. There was, however, a possible fly in the ointment. Norman sources relate that Duke William of Normandy chose to visit King Edward's court soon after Godwin's exile.
Neither Duke William's visit to England nor Harold's later visit to Duke William's court, which is portrayed so vividly in the biotapestry, are mentioned at all in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle.
Oh, that's suspicious.
Yeah, this gives some pause, but I tend to accept them both as actual events. The sources are just too contemporary for them to be promoting what everyone would have known as a big lie. A visit of Duke William to his childless and now wifeless cousin to press his claim to his kinsman's throne makes some sense to me.
But it also makes sense to me why the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would fail to include it.
Yes, it would.
So I really couldn't agree with you more.
Yeah, these documents are not objective histories. They are documents of propaganda.
Which is what makes it so much fun to study.
Yeah.
So, if so, William's candidacy was put on check, as King Edward was now no longer without a wife. However, all was not well among the Godwinsons. The eldest son, Sweyn, seems to have been a bit of a wild man.
A bit? Yeah.
He was really a loose cannon. As Earl of Hereford and Gloucestershire, he followed his own foreign policy, allying himself with the Welsh king Griffith ap Llywelyn of Gwynedd and Powys, a rival of Earl Leofric of Mercia. To make matters worse, and this one is pretty bad, he abducted an abbess and refused to return her to her abbey.
Yeah, he kept her as long as he wanted, he said.
Right. And after being ordered out of the country, he murdered his cousin Bjorn.
Yeah, that sort of tore it with the rest of the family.
It did. He had already lost the support of his brother Harold, and the murder of Bjorn cut his ties with his other brothers. Somehow, however, Sweyn managed to obtain pardon for his crimes, just in time to be exiled a second time, along with his father and brothers. While Godwin and his other sons planned their return, Sweyn chose instead to go on pilgrimage to the Pope, and he died while returning from Rome.
A blessing and a relief to everyone, including his brothers. So having weathered the crisis of 1051-1052, Godwin and his sons were back in favor and stronger than ever. It's been estimated that the combined annual revenues of the House of Godwin was about the same, if not slightly greater, than those of the king.
They are overmighty subjects, are they not?
They are the definition of an overmighty subject. When the old earl passed away in 1053, Harold traded his earldom of East Anglia for a much greater one that combined his father's earldom of Wessex with his brother Sweyn's composite earldom of Herefordshire, Gloucestershire, Somerset, Oxfordshire, and Berkshire. East Anglia and Essex were divided between the two youngest brothers, Gurth and Leofwin, while Tostig became Earl of Northumbria upon the death of Earl Siward in 1055.
The last was not a match made in heaven. The Northumbrians, much like the North in Game of Thrones, had a strong sense of regional identity, and Tostig was a southerner. He didn't endear himself to his subjects when he chose to negotiate with, rather than fight, King Malcolm of Scotland when he invaded in 1058. Tostig was a favorite of King Edward and often left the north to attend the royal court. When he was present in Northumbria, he ruled with a heavy hand, especially when it came to taxes. He saw his job as bringing an unruly earldom under order, and he used harsh methods to do so. Lacking local support, he relied on his housecarls, his Danish military household, to enforce his rule.
What tore it for the Northumbrians is Tostig having two Northumbrian nobles, Gamel son of Orm and Ulf son of Dolphin, killed. The year was 1064, and the Northumbrians had been chafing under Tostig's rule now for 9 years. Tostig invited Gamel and Ulf to his palace in York to discuss grievances, but broke his promise of safe conduct and ordered them executed. The killings were seen as an act of treachery, and they were, and spurred a full-scale revolt. In 1065, Tostig's palace in York was stormed by the Thanes of Yorkshire, led by Gamel's and Ulf's kinsmen. The rebels slaughtered Tostig's Danish housecarls, but Tostig himself managed to escape. The Northumbrian leaders then met in an assembly in which they legally outlawed Tostig and chose in his place Morcar, brother of Earl Edwin of Mercia. It was a prudent choice on their part. The brothers were the grandsons of Earl Leofrich and represented the only English noble clan that came anywhere near the House of Godwin in terms of power, wealth, and followers. The Northumbrian rebels, joined by Earl Edwin's forces from Mercia, marched south in a show of force. Tostig, of course, sought help from King Edward and from his brother. An enfeebled King Edward was willing but not able. Harold wasn't even willing. He saw no profit in confronting the rebels and risking a full-scale civil war. Harold essentially said to Tostig, "You blew it with the Northumbrians, that's your fault." Tostig had to take refuge with his in-laws in Flanders, and Tostig was furious with his brother Harold and clearly determined to get revenge. Harold may have had an ulterior motive in refusing to intervene on behalf of his brother. Tostig was a favorite of King Edward. Harold was not. Both were sons of Earl Godwin and brothers-in-law to the king. Harold may already have been thinking in terms of succession. His claim to the throne was no greater than that of Tostig's, and would have been far worse if the childless king designated Tostig as his chosen successor. Lending his support to Morcar and Edwin at this juncture could bring him dividends later when he sought election in the Witan. Considerations of this sort may well have trumped brotherly love.
Well, we've already seen that relations among the Godwinson brothers could be fraught.
Yeah.
So politics in England were in a pretty unsettled state. And then, in the fall of 1065, King Edward the Confessor fell ill. He knew his end was approaching, so he was able to arrange to die in Westminster Abbey. But he was childless, and thus his death in January of 1066 left no clear heir to the English throne. There were no fewer than 4 possible successors: an Edgar, 2 Harolds, and a William. And the Edgar doesn't matter for now.
We'll get to him at the very end.
We will.
Yeah.
But it's really only 3 at the point we're talking about. So we will set out their claims to the throne in turn. Richard, why don't you start with Harold Godwinson?
Harold Godwinson was the candidate who ultimately succeeded in becoming king in January of 1066. He was the most powerful magnate in England, and he was the man on the spot. He was the only one of the 3 claimants who was even in England when Edward the Confessor died. Now, constitutionally, if that isn't too anachronistic a term, constitutionally, the English monarchy was elective. The Witan, the late King's Council that included the great magnates, the ealdormen, and the greatest landowners and the upper clergy of the realm, elected Anglo-Saxon kings from those who were deemed throne-worthy. Until the advent of the Danish kings, this had meant those who could trace their ancestry to King Alfred the Great. Sweyn, Cnut, Harald Hardrada, and Cnut in reality were kings by conquest, but they were also formally elected, anointed, and invested with the throne. Harold's claim was neither by biological descent nor by conquest. The closest he came to the former was that he had been King Edward's brother-in-law. Nevertheless, he was elected king within days of Edward's death for 3 main reasons. First, because he seemed the best able to take up the burden. Second, he was by far the wealthiest man in England with the greatest number of personal followers. And third, because, and this depends on which source you believe, the king on his deathbed seems to have designated Harold as his heir. So Harold had proximity going for him, as well as health, his wealth, and his supporters.
Right. Harold was crowned king at Westminster Abbey by the Bishop of London.
And it's really kind of interesting here that what you have is virtually all the bishops present and all the ealdormen are present because they all know that the old king is dying. So the Witan is a full Witan and you can act immediately.
Right. Normally, the Archbishop of Canterbury would have crowned the king. But the archbishop, as we know, is a guy named Stigand, who is considered by almost everybody to have been made archbishop in an irregular fashion.
Yeah, Stigand had really bad timing when he got elected as archbishop. All archbishops are supposed to go to Rome to receive what's called a pallium, which is this robe which is an indication of their status as an archbishop, and it's given to them by the Pope. And it's basically the Pope's recognition of them as archbishop. In 1058, when Stigand went to Rome to get his pallium, what he found was that the papal see was occupied by a cleric who had assumed the papal name Pope Benedict X. The problem is that this Benedict X was not really Pope. He's what is now called an anti-pope. The medieval Roman Catholic Church was given to schisms in which more than one man claimed to be Pope. Anti-popes are those who are not recognized today by the Church. He had been chosen by the local Roman aristocracy in opposition to the reformers' candidate, Pope Nicholas II. So, Stigand never bothered to get a new pallium from either Nicholas II or his successor Alexander II. So having him anoint Harold as king in 1066 would have led to questions about Harold's legitimacy.
And that would not have been good, because consecration was a very powerful political tool. Harold did not want anything casting his consecration into doubt. He didn't want a little asterisk. But fortunately, the Archbishop of York, Ealdred, was also present in London for the election and consecration of the new king. I should have said Archbishop of York in London, not Bishop of London.
Yes. And the usually reliable early 12th century monastic chronicler John of Worcester does say that Archbishop Ealdred did the honors.
But the pro-Norman Bayeux Tapestry shows us Archbishop Stigand, which is kind of a lie. It's pro-Norman propaganda. Really, it's fake news. The idea is to make Harold kingship look illegitimate from the start.
So that's our first claimant, the successful claimant. So how about the unsuccessful Harold?
So that was Harald Sigurdsson, more commonly known as Harald Hardrada, King of Norway. And I'm sorry that we've got two Harolds. We'll try to use his nickname Hardrada so that we can keep them straight. Hardrada means stern counsel or hard ruler, so it's kind of like Unrad. It's a cognate, right, in Norse. Harald Hardrada was an amazing figure in his own right, probably the last of the great Viking leaders.
His life is the stuff of sagas. Literally, it's the stuff of sagas, as Harald Hardrada is the subject of a Viking saga by the 13th century Icelandic poet and historian Snorri Sturluson.
Yes, he was a romantic figure, or at least a romantic figure in a brutal Viking way. Hardrada was 51 years old in 1066, and he had a long career behind him already. In 1030, the 15-year-old Hardrada had been driven out of Norway in a power struggle, and he ended up leading his own band of warriors in Eastern Europe, where he fought on behalf of Prince Yaroslav the Wise,
the Grand Prince of Kiev. Although we tend to focus upon the Vikings' explorations, raids, conquest in the west, it's worth remembering that Vikings also went east, and that the Kievan Rus were Scandinavians.
Harald Hardrada then took his warriors south to Constantinople, where he served in the famous Varangian Guard of the Byzantine emperors. Next, he made his way back to Russian territory, married the daughter of Prince Yaroslav, and finally ended up back in Norway, where he engineered his succession to the throne after the Norwegian king Magnus.
That was Magnus the Good. I have no idea why he was good, but he goes down as Magnus the Good. And Magnus the Good was Hardrada's nephew. Magnus, who had spent his youth in exile in Russia during the reign of Cnut, returned after Cnut's death. When the Norwegians rebelled against Danish rule, Magnus was invited back to ascend the throne. Rather than fight him, Cnut's son and successor Harthacnut recognized Magnus as king of Norway and agreed that whoever outlived the other would succeed to both Norway and Denmark. When Harthacnut died, Magnus became ruler of the joint kingdom. He appointed Cnut's nephew, Svein Estridsson, as regent over Denmark, but Svein's ambitions wouldn't allow him to settle for being merely a regent, and he rebelled. That's where Hardrada enters the story. When Hardrada returned to Scandinavia in 1046, he found a turbulent political environment ripe for exploitation. He initially threw in with Spain, seeing that as his best bet to acquire a portion of his nephew's kingdom, but was then offered a better deal by Magnus. Magnus promised to make him joint ruler if he switched allegiances, so he did. And when Magnus died in the following year, Hardrada became king of Norway and Svein king of Denmark, though of course neither recognized the other's legitimacy. It was as king of Norway that Harald earned his nickname, Harsh Ruler.
So we have here a famous warrior with an impressive track record. Plus, Harald Hardrada has just a hint of a claim to the English throne. It's very tenuous, but here is how it goes. Back in the 1030s, when Harthacnut, son of Cnut, was king of Denmark and trying to become king of England, Harthacnut had made an agreement with King Magnus of Norway that since neither of them had any children, if either one died, they would inherit each other's kingdom. Now, Harald Hardrada had succeeded to the throne of Norway after King Magnus, so he claimed that he had inherited this claim to the English throne if the English king died without heirs. Are you with me so far?
Yeah.
Right? So this meant that when Edward the Confessor died without heirs, Harald Hardrada should automatically have become king. No?
No.
It is pretty thin. Magnus himself had not in fact pressed his claim in 1042 when Edward the Confessor became king because Magnus had his hands full at the time and the English really didn't want him.
Yeah.
So Harald Hardrada probably wouldn't have done anything about the claim in 1066 either if somebody hadn't put him up to it.
Yeah, and we'll tell you about that in a while.
Right.
But first, we need to talk about the final claimant, William, Duke of Normandy, William the Bastard. His claim was less tenuous than Hardrada's was, at least in terms of blood relations, and it was a lot stronger than Harold Godwinson's in every respect. But it was also pretty complicated. So, Jenny, I think I will need to have a couple of genealogical tables in our show notes.
I would say that's a definite yes.
Okay, so...
But before we explain why William thought he had a right to be King of England, we need to say a little bit about his background and personality, because I think that will help us to understand why William felt bold enough to decide to press his claim by force of arms. Where did William get the self-confidence to do such a thing?
Yeah.
William was about 36 years old, but he had already experienced a lifetime of military campaigns and political intrigue. He was the illegitimate son of Duke Robert III of Normandy and a woman named Herleva, who was probably the daughter of some sort of royal official in the Norman town of Falaise.
Hence the nickname William the Bastard.
That's right. Now, at this period, the church was starting to crack down on illegitimacy. So Duke Robert had to work very hard to get his nobles to accept his son William as his heir, despite the fact that he was a bastard. Now, of course, this nickname was probably not used to his face.
I'm sure that William was sensitive about his parentage. It was bad enough to be a bastard, but his mother wasn't even a noblewoman. All we know for certain about her father, Fulbert, was that he was a townsman of Falaise. He became chamberlain to Duke Robert, but we don't know whether this happened before or after his daughter became the Duke's concubine. There was a persistent rumor, or perhaps slander, that Fulbert had been a tanner, which was regarded as a noxious trade. According to the Anglo-Norman historian Orderic Vitalis, writing in the early 12th century, the defenders of the border town of Alençon taunted Duke William during a siege by hanging pelts and furs on the city ramparts and beating them to show their contempt for the grandson of a tanner.
And this rumor went down, even down to Henry II's reign, this idea that Herleva had been a tanner's daughter was well known.
And when William finally took Alençon, he ordered that the hands and feet of those who had mocked him be chopped off.
He wasn't very happy about that. So things got a lot worse for William in 1035 when his father went off on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and died on the return journey. There's a lot of people who die on pilgrimage.
It's a dangerous thing to do.
So 8-year-old William was left at the mercy of hostile factions of Norman nobles. William had to spend his childhood and young adulthood fending off serious challenges to his rule as Duke, and sometimes these challenges came uncomfortably close to home, such as the time that his close kinsman and supporter, Count Gilbert de Brienne, was murdered while staying in the same house as young William. So this murder is occurring under the same roof. But William the Bastard is made of stern stuff, and he persevered against his noble enemies. He was able to consolidate ducal control of Normandy as never before.
He did this through almost constant warfare against unruly Norman vassals and hostile neighbors. When he was young and weak, William was supported in his efforts to retain the duchy by his nominal overlord, Henry I, the Capetian King of France. I say nominal because at this time, what the King of France actually ruled was little more than the Ile-de-France, the territory around Paris. 11th century Capetian kings were constantly trying to weaken the power of dukes and counts, who were more rivals than vassals. In 1047, King Henry I secured the duchy for William by crushing the rebel Norman barons in the Battle of Val-les-Dunes. But political alliances in this age could shift quickly, and 7 years later, when Duke William married Matilda, the daughter of Count Baldwin V of Flanders, King Henry, threatened by this marriage alliance, responded by invading Normandy. By 1054, however, William had consolidated ducal authority in Normandy. Val-les-Dunes had broken the power of the main Norman rebel barons. There still were some rebel barons, but the main ones were God, and William had replaced them with kinsmen and loyal followers. The invading French army advanced on two fronts, and William matched that by splitting his forces. While he advanced against King Henry I, the half of his army, led by Robert, Count of Eu, William Giffard, William de Warenne, and Robert of Mortimer, decisively engaged and defeated the French forces led by the king's brother in the Battle of Mortimer. Upon receiving the news, King Henry broke off the invasion. But in 1157 he tried again, this time in alliance with Geoffrey Martel, Count of Anjou. This invasion was not unexpected. In some ways, it was overdue. The border between Normandy and Anjou had long been contested territory, and both Duke William and Count Geoffrey claimed overlordship over the county of Maine. Encouraged by the support of King Henry I, Geoffrey now made his move. William at first merely had scouts report on the movement of the invading army, which was occupied with the typical military activities of the period, ravaging the countryside and pillaging towns. Some historians explain William's initial passivity by saying that he was reluctant to fight his royal lord. But I find that unlikely. I think that William was demonstrating patience. Battles were risky affairs, and a general did not engage unless he had confidence that he was likely to win the battle. And that usually meant that he had a greater number of troops. William waited and watched, and when the invading army was divided while crossing the River Dives near Varennes, William made his move. He ambushed the half of the French Angevin force that had not yet crossed the river and wiped them out. That ended the invasion. Despite having spent most of his life to this point campaigning, Varennes was actually the first battle in which William was in command, and he won that battle by moving quickly and taking the enemy by surprise. Varennes can be seen as a dry run for Hastings.
So William had good reason to think that he was capable of taking on a challenge as big as conquering England. Which brings us to William's claim to the English throne. His claim had three parts to it. First was he was Edward the Confessor's kinsman, and this is where you have to think of the genealogy.
Yeah.
Edward's mother, Emma, was also William's great-aunt. So they were related by blood, though not terribly closely, and only in the female line. Now you might think that the relationship should have to flow through the male line for it to provide a claim to the English throne, but in this period, notions of descent were still forming. So there was a ghost of a rationale for the claim via William's relationship to Emma. and he was the only one of the three main claimants to the throne in 1066 to have an actual blood relationship to the previous king, Edward the Confessor.
Yes, though he was not the only male at that time who could claim a blood relationship. Edward had a great-nephew, Harold, son of Earl Ralph the Timid. He could have been our third claimant to the English throne named Harold, but he wasn't. His father, Earl Ralph, who died in 1057, was the son of King Edward's full sister, Godwin. That made Harold a great-grandson of Athelred the Unready. Harold, like his namesake Harold Godwinson, was in England when Edward died. He may even have been at the dying king's bedside, as he was then the ward of Queen Edith. But because he was just a child, Harold was never considered as a candidate for the throne, which was just as well, as Harold survived the conquest and became the progenitor of the baronial Sudeley family of Gloucestershire and Worcester. But by far the best claim to the English throne in terms of genealogy belonged to our fourth candidate, Edgar Atheling, whom we are going to talk about later.
Yeah, we're going to keep him on ice for now.
Yes.
More potent was the claim that King Edward had actually designated William as his successor, and that Harold Godwinson knew this and had sworn to support William's claim. And thus, by taking the throne himself, Harold was therefore guilty of perjury.
Nothing in this period is straightforward, and the story of Harold's oath to William is problematic. Like the story of Duke William's visit to Edward the Confessor's court in 1051, this story appears only in Norman sources. The Norman sources assert that in 1064, Earl Harold had been traveling to Normandy perhaps to negotiate the release of a brother held hostage by William. Another brother, when he was blown off course, landed in the county of Ponthieu, just to the north of Normandy. There he fell into the hands of the hostile Count of Ponthieu, who held him for ransom. Duke William arranged for Harold's release, and in exchange he made Harold swear that he would back William's claim to the throne when the time came.
And this is the story you see illustrated in the Bayeux Tapestry. But as we've seen, the tapestry is Norman propaganda, and as Richard said, the story is found only in Norman sources. Harold's trip to Normandy is absent from all the recensions of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the life of King Edward, commissioned by Harold's sister, Queen Edith. It is potentially a self-serving fiction. Some historians believe the story, and some don't.
But I'm one of the historians who does believe that story.
I actually think it happened.
And I'll explain why. It appears in all the Norman sources in varying levels of detail. These are contemporary or near contemporary sources. There would be too many people in both England and Normandy who would know that it was an outright lie. And although the story does not appear in the life of King Edward, its author, while admiring and sympathetic to Harold, significantly says of him, quote, he was overly generous with oaths. Doesn't explain what the context is, but it seems to me that that context is pretty clear. Perhaps the most compelling evidence is that it was the basis of an appeal William made to the papacy to bless the invasion. The Duke sent churchmen from Normandy to Pope Alexander II. He argued that as king, he would bring the English church into stricter compliance with papal policy, which at that time was support for the Gregorian reform.
And there's another reason that I believe that the trip probably happened, which is that some later English sources come up with very implausible explanations for why Harold ended up in Normandy. He was blown off course during a fishing trip, this kind of stuff, because then it wouldn't look like an official delegation and all of that. And I don't think they would have bothered to explain this away if they didn't have to. If people didn't believe that it was true. Now, interestingly, the tactic of getting papal approval for an invasion would be used again when the English later invaded Ireland.
It gives legitimacy to invasions. Would ordinarily be just an invasion and would be a secular matter, now becomes a religious matter. But the Pope needed a moral reason to depose a crowned and anointed king. That's where the argument that Harold had broken his oath came in. Alexander II not only gave his blessing to William, but provided him with a special papal banner that he could fight under. The Norman Conquest, like the Spanish Reconquista, became a Christian holy war and a forerunner of the Crusades.
Now, this is a culture that values oaths very highly. Oaths were taken upon holy relics, and these are the foundation of the English and Norman legal systems.
So much so that the comprehensive law code Archbishop Wulfstan drew up for King Cnut gave as the penalty for swearing a false oath on relics the loss of the hand that was laid upon the relics, or the payment, and this is a huge sum of money, of half of one's weregild to be divided between the culprit's lord and the bishop. And until one made amends before God, the person who forswore his oath lost his right to give an oath, which meant he was no longer lawworthy. And that was precisely what Harold was accused of having done, forsworn an oath he gave upon relics. My guess is that Harold did confess this and did receive absolution, perhaps claiming that he gave the oath not freely, but under coercion. But that's only speculation.
I would find it very easy to believe in the coercion.
Yes, I would too. Well, once again, we are running long. I had hoped that we could cover the Norman Conquest in a single episode, but this is a story in which the details matter, so I think it best we leave off here with the three main candidates to succeed King Edward the Confessor and their claims to the throne, and let's return for a second episode on the conquest itself.
Looking forward to it.
Okay, then let's do that. So, until then, bye for now.